Back, everyone. Our next speaker today, Sophy Wong, is a designer, costumer, and maker of creative and artistic wearable tech. Today, her talk's going to be about a bunch of her finished pieces and how she gets from idea through technique to finished technology. So please join me in welcoming to the Hackaday Supercon stage, Sophy Wong.
Hello, I'm Sophy Wong, and like he said, I'm a designer and a maker, and I love to make wearable technology. But the kind of wearable technology I like to make, I call artistic wearable technology. And I sort of make that distinction because I know when I say wearable technology, a lot of people think of consumer wearable technology like smartwatches and working VR headsets. And I don't really make work like that. I make work like this. I like to put LEDs into costumes and fashion pieces in creative ways to sort of imagine maybe what the future might look like. I like to use technology as a creative tool in my process. So I do a lot of digital fabrication techniques, like I use my 3D printer and I use my laser cutter a lot. And I like to incorporate technology into the finished pieces as well. So I put a lot of lights into things because that's a very visually expressive use of technology. It looks great in photography and video. And sometimes I do incorporate like a functional aspect to that technology. So this is a skirt that has lights in it, but there's also a temperature sensor in there, so the lights will change color according to the ambient temperature. And I just really like to dream about what the future looks like and sort of create costumes and fashion pieces that kind of reflect my visions. And recently I've been working a lot with 3D printing on fabric, which is a really cool technique. And if you were at Superconference the last time it was in person in 2019, I actually had this jacket with me. So it's an LED jacket, and all of those hexagons on the back of it are 3D printed directly onto fabric. So here's sort of a closer look at those diffuser panels. They're just PLA printed directly onto mesh fabric. And this is a super cool technique that I just really got into when I found out about it. And so another project that I had with me last time was this 3D printed dress. So it's an entire dress made with this 3D printing on fabric technique. And it was in progress when I was here last time, and I actually did complete it. So I want to talk to you about how I finished this dress, and then I'm really excited to show you what I've done after that and where I want to go next. But first, let me back up and just explain this technique of 3D printing on fabric, because it's a really cool technique if you've never seen it before or heard of it before. It's also not a technique that I invented by any means. There were a lot of other people in the maker community working with this technique and sharing their process, and that's how I learned about it. And in fact, the person I learned about it from is here today, is David Shorey. And if you want to learn more about this technique, which I guarantee you will want to, you should definitely look up his work because it's amazing. And that's where I found out about it. So here's how it works. You need to start with a model like this, which is it's a 3D model where all of these hexagonal shapes are individual bodies, so they're disconnected and they're not touching each other. And you take that to your 3D printer and you start printing your model. You print one layer, and then you pause that print and insert a layer of mesh fabric. So you want like an open mesh fabric, and this is nylon tulle that I'm printing on, or nylon mesh. And then you resume the rest of your print, and that fabric gets sandwiched between the first two layers of your print. So then when you remove the print, you are connecting those individual bodies together, and they become this flexible panel with whatever your 3D printed shapes are attached to this panel. So here's another example of what your model might look like. So these are all individual bodies. And then here's what it looks like when it's printed. So it retains this really cool flexible property, and you can sort of manipulate and control the behavior of this material purely through the shapes that you're introducing to it on this surface. So it's super fascinating. And like I said, you really need to go and do a search and look up David Shorey, look up So Printed on Instagram, and see what other people are doing, because everyone's doing different things, and whatever shape you're introducing to the material produces different results, and it's fascinating. So I wanted to learn a lot about this technique, so I went really deep with experiments, and I basically just tried a lot of different shapes and models, and I varied the shapes that I was printing, and also the widths between all the shapes, the depth, the amount of material I was putting on there, and it kind of just generated a swatch library for myself of ideas and shapes and behaviors. And as I worked through all of these prints on a small scale, I started to wonder if I could actually make an entire garment. Like, could I scale this up to an entire wearable, full body garment? And so I challenged myself to make a dress. And so this is the completed dress. And now I'll show you how I got from those samples to a fully completed wearable dress. So I started with some visual inspiration and some ideas about what this dress might look like. But I did not spend very much time in this design phase because I really wanted to get to the actual creation process, because I knew that simply scaling it up and just making it big was going to expose a lot of challenges I wasn't encountering in the small scale. So I kind of had a general idea of what I wanted it to look like. And then I drafted a bodice, which is how I would make any dress out of fabric, but keeping in mind my output size. So my 3D printer is only capable of printing like a panel around 10 by 10 inches if I allow room to tape that panel to the bed. So I had to compose the whole dress out of pieces that were small enough to come out of my 3D printer. And I used that swatch sample library that I had generated to select patterns and shapes that would lend themselves to my design. And then when I knew what I wanted to make, I cut up my mock-up. I literally cut the muslin apart, scanned it into my computer, and then digitized it in Illustrator. And then I take those pattern pieces into Fusion 360 and 3D model my shapes. So I spent a lot of time in Fusion 360 figuring out how to model all of this. And I created like so many bodies that my file almost like exploded my computer. And so this is like a quarter of the designed file. And then here's what those pieces look like when they're printed out and just draped over my dress form. So I started generating these pieces, and I knew I had to figure out how I was going to attach these pieces together to create the dress. So I realized that I could actually use another tool. I could use my 3D pen to weld the pieces together on the back side. So I'm just overlapping the pieces on the front and then just welding them together on the back, so you get a really seamless join that retains the flexibility across that joint. And you can't tell where I've joined the pieces together because I'm kind of hiding it in plain sight in the surface design that I'm creating. So on the left side, this is my my lining layer. So I had to kind of deal with the fact that I was creating giant pieces of this 3D printed material. I was building up a lot of weight. It's like 3.5 spools of filament. And I also was creating like a giant walking snag hazard. It's like 5 million pokey points of plastic, and they all want to jab into your body when you're wearing this. So I had to keep it off of my skin. And then I also have to deal with the fact that this mesh that I'm printing on is transparent, so there's an opacity issue I have to deal with. So this silk lining layer solves all of those problems. It adds some stability to the pieces and some strength, and it creates some comfort. It's a comfort layer, so nothing is poking into my skin. And then it also is a functional design element for maintenance and for cleaning. So I created this 3D printed shell in an entire piece. It's actually 2 pieces because I kept the top and the bottom separate, but they can be completely removed from this lining layer so that when I need to do, if I need to clean it, if I need to launder it, I can remove it and just launder the part that is touching my skin and do any maintenance I need to do to this 3D printed portion and then reassemble it back together. I also had to figure out how to put a zipper into this thing, which, wait for it, totally worked. Thank you. Yeah, I'll accept that applause because I had to do that many times to get that actually to line up and work. But that's just hand sewing an invisible zipper into a dress. And then on this side, this is just kind of a nerdy detail for my sewing friends out there. I didn't catch the seam allowances of the 3D printed layer in the seams of the lining layer, which is how you traditionally would connect 2 layers of a garment together. But I wanted to make sure that that 3D printed layer was separate so I could remove it without having to deconstruct the lining. So it drapes really well on the body, and people ask me what it feels like when you wear this, and it kind of feels like wearing like a heavy sequined gown or like chainmail, because it's rigid, but it also drapes extremely well, and the weight of it just makes it kind of hug to your body. So it's pretty neat. I mean, it feels a little bit like armor, but like if an evening dress was armor. So here's a look at some of the pieces that make up the skirt, and here's the skirt really getting assembled. So I'm making gigantic pieces of this material, and I'm doing a lot of those joins. So assembling it after printing it was actually more work and took more time than actually printing it. And so gosh, my dyslexia, this is so hard. On the left, it's almost complete, but you can see I left that join in the middle there. So in the complete dress on the right, you can still see that it's separated, and that's so that it could split up the weight of the garment. So the weight is not all hanging from the shoulders. The weight of the skirt is hanging from the waist, and the weight of the top is on the shoulders. So that just divides it up a little bit. So I got to the end, I finished this dress, and I was like, yes, that's cool, I finished this dress. But what do I do next? Like, what do I do with all of the stuff that I learned from doing this? And like, do I make another 3D printed dress? Which maybe like makes sense to normal people, but I just don't like to make the same thing twice. Like I hate doing that. And it also got to this point of finishing this dress during the pandemic when I was already kind of like creatively blocked, and I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do next with all of this information, because I looked at this dress and I thought like, this entire thing was an experiment and an exploration to see if I could do this. So it's just an exploration of a technique, and I feel successful. I feel like I completed it, but I wish that I had spent more time in the design phase. And how am I going to take what I've learned? Because I love this technique, but how am I going to take what I learned about this technique and apply it to projects in a way where the projects are about more than just how I made them? So like I said, like the pandemic was sort of like an introspective time for me, and I had to like sit down and kind of organize my thoughts around design and making in general. So I thought long and hard about it, and I was like, I need to figure out how I'm gonna go beyond this technique. And I think it's because my background is in graphic design. I came up with a graphic to illustrate my personal design philosophy. And it starts out like this. It's like a triangle or a pyramid. And the first layer is tools. It's the widest layer because I love tools and I want to learn about all the tools that I can so I can use them when I need them. So tools, this is where I put like my 3D printer, my laser cutter, all the way to like a bandsaw or even a hammer. They're really powerful and they're force multipliers, but they don't do anything on their own. A tool by itself is just an inert object. Like a hammer is just an object. But if you take a hammer and you hammer a nail into a piece of wood, that's technique. So you need technique to make a tool really useful. So the next layer is technique. And I love techniques too. I want to learn a lot of techniques as well because I want to be able to use them. So techniques are really powerful. This is where I put 3D printing on fabric. This is how I use my 3D printer. And I love techniques, but I don't want to get stuck on this layer. So I want to go beyond it. So the next layer is concept. And concept is the core idea behind my project. So, you know, I think my 3D printed dress was a great deep dive into tools and techniques, but now I want to go beyond. I want to take that and I want to apply it to telling a story or communicating a message or solving a problem. And in my design education, my design professors actually taught us to be sort of tool and technique agnostic, that, you know, tools come and go, and so don't rely too heavily on a specific tool because you're always going to want to learn how to use new tools as they come out. Software is a perfect example of this. We're always going to be learning new software. And then technique as well, like technique maybe lasts a little bit longer than a tool, but it becomes a trend eventually, and then it dies too. So you want to be able to absorb and use new techniques too. So don't focus too much on that either. But concept endures. So if you have a great idea or great concept, then it transcends the tools and techniques that you used to make your project. So my design professors were like, make concept the point of your work. And I agree with them a little bit. Like I do think concept's very important, and that if you can apply tools and techniques to concepts, that's what makes it really powerful. But I also don't think that concept is the end. I think there's something beyond concept, and that's impact. Because it doesn't matter if I have a great concept that makes sense to me. If my viewer doesn't get it, then that concept is useless. So true design success for me is when I can use tools, techniques, and apply them to concepts to achieve impact, so that I can put my project down in front of someone and they get it. They're like, oh, awesome, it's whatever my concept was. And I don't have to explain to them how I made it or how it works for them to understand why I think it's interesting. So I still think that tools, techniques, and concept are really important, but I want to just remember that I want to design for impact. And I really tried hard to come up with a cool acronym for this, but it doesn't exist. So I just call it Sophie's Pyramid of Power. And just organizing it into this kind of hierarchy just helps keep me on track. It gives me some goals to reach for in my projects, and I know I'm not going to hit all the way to impact on every single project. Like, I think, like I said, my my deep dive into the technique to make that 3D printed dress. Like sometimes some of my projects will purely be so I can learn a technique or a tool, but when I want to go beyond technique, this will be my strategy to get there. So here's my little cheat sheet of what all the layers mean. And then I was working on this slide deck right before Halloween, so I also turned it into a candy corn. So it's a candy corn of power. So the next few projects are more attempts of just me trying to go beyond technique with this 3D printing on fabric thing and complete some projects, but try to keep in mind my candy corn of power. Ooh, that's a scary thing to say. And I think they kind of achieve like varying degrees of that, because this is a journey I'm on, and you know, it's a work in progress. So this project is a headpiece, and conceptually I wanted this to be inspired by sort of like a 1920s hairstyle, because I thought that this technique creates such great draping properties. I thought that would be a good application for it on the body, and so I wanted to kind of achieve sort of a hair-like quality. So it's kind of like a wig, like a 3D printed wig. But it's the same process that I used to create the dress, and that's the great thing about doing a deep dive into a technique. I worked out all of these steps, so I'm scanning my patterns into my computer and just refining the shapes and sizes over several rounds of design. And I intentionally spent a little more time in this phase to try to visualize what I was creating and just checking against my concept to see if I was on track to create the impact that I wanted. And I did print tests like I always do, and this was like 5 million retractions on my 3D printer, and it almost did not survive. But you know, sometimes you spend all that time making a mock-up. This is why you do these mock-ups. And I put all of these together on my head form, and I was like, I hate it. Like, I didn't like it. But I knew I didn't like it because I had a really strong concept in my mind, and I was like, this is not hitting it. So I went back and I redesigned, and I discovered this quantum PLA from Matter Hackers. It's that dichromatic filament. So it's literally the filament is split in half, and half of it is pink and half of it is gold. And it's really cool stuff. Like, it depends on the angle that you're looking at it. It has this color changing property. So I saw this and I was like, this will be great. I think this will really accentuate the kinds of shapes that I want to create in this piece. So, but I also wanted to remember that I'm making something wearable for the head, and I'm thinking of it like a wig. So I wanted to apply this color-changing property in a symmetrical way. So I tried to apply it sort of symmetrically, working out from the center of the head outwards. And here's a look at one of the 3D models. So this is just one little piece that goes over your ear. And here it is in the slicer. And I don't know if you can see that, but it took 9 hours just to print this one little piece. And when it was done, you could see like that color changing property it's really cool. So, you know, this is a material. I would put materials on the same layer as tools. And this is all the pieces that make up the whole headpiece. So this was about 60 to 70 hours of printing, but everything prints flat because I'm designing everything flat, and then when I assemble it, it wraps around the head like that. And then I'm using the same technique of connecting all the pieces together with my 3D pen, keeping them separate from the lining layer underneath. And so on the right there, I'm just hand sewing it together. And here's the finished piece. And yeah, I do think this might be an example of a project that kind of only makes sense to me. I grant that it's a little bit weird, but I think that I'm on the right track in terms of designing for a concept. And I think that when I style this up in a photo shoot, like, I think the impact will be there. So the next piece is a necklace, and I wanted to get a more dimensional application of the 3D printing, so I made it much deeper than what I was printing in the other projects. And I also really wanted to incorporate lighting into this piece. But conceptually, I wanted this to be inspired by the Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, who does a lot of work with point lights, and she makes these really beautiful experiential installations with just hovering points of light. And so I wanted to do something inspired by that that wraps around the body. So I made a necklace. And so this was a new tool for me. This is digital pattern making software. So I thought that this piece, because it's small and because I had worked out the rest of my techniques, I thought that this would be a great way to kind of get my feet wet with some digital pattern making. But then I still print it out and put it on my mock-up, on my dress form, to make a physical mock-up, because I really need to see these things in the physical world in 3D space. So this is me figuring out where the lights were going to go. And then I used my same process to just kind of scan that information back into my computer and create like just the footprints of where I wanted to extrude. And then I print that out on just paper and check it so I can make sure that I'm on the right track. And here's what the STLs look like. So they're very deep. And this is the necklace in my slicer. So this I could print in one go. It takes up the entire bed of my 3D printer. And this is like 2.5 days of printing. And it weighs like 350 grams. So it's heavy. But I love that I don't have to do any of that assembly after the fact with my 3D pen. Here I am removing it from the bed, which is a pretty delicate process, but I did manage to get it off without damaging that mesh material underneath. And then here's the complete piece, and it has this amazing like jiggly quality that I had no idea would happen. Sometimes you just can't predict these things. But I do have this necklace with me, so if you want to see it, come and find me, and you can jiggle it. And then I also added that silk lining again, and this time it also is housing the circuit. So these are the programmable LEDs that I added into this piece. And this is really cool. So when you use digital software to create your patterns and you can create every layer with the same file, it lines up perfectly. So that's just a really satisfying and efficient benefit to working in this digital workflow. So that's the finished piece on the right. And I feel like I'm getting closer to the top of my pyramid here, because I can look at this piece and I can see how I'm going to style it, what it would be useful for, and what kind of outfit or costume this could go with. So this is the last piece I'm going to share, and I have this piece with me as well. This is a glove that I made with the 3D printing on fabric technique, but I really wanted to use the 3D printing on fabric in service of a strong concept. So I decided that this piece was going to be the first piece of a spacesuit. So I'm designing a glove that I can expand out to create an entire spacesuit. And so rather than cover the entire glove with 3D printed fabric, I thought about where I could apply it on this piece where it would make the most sense. So I kept it on the flatter part of the arm so it doesn't go past the knuckles. And then the fingers are actually just 3D printed TPU, so it's flexible filament. So the fingers retain the most flexibility, and then the rest of the glove is soft enough for your wrist movement and your arm movement. I know it looks kind of like a Nintendo Power Glove, but think spacesuit. So this is a mock-up of my idea for creating that outer glove. So that muslin area is where I wanted to put the 3D printed fabric. And my idea was just to slip it over an existing glove and to keep that layer separate so that if I want to resize this for a different person that has a different size hand, I can just switch out that glove from underneath. So this is just piecing together ideas and mocking up ideas with physical materials. And I wanted to see if I could use these flexible, tiny silicone-coated LED strands to make this glove light up. So I wanted to fit them between the spaces between my 3D printed shapes. And I always do a lot of print tests when I'm developing my idea. So this is an example of one of those tests, and I'm printing directly on a mirror, and that's giving me a really shiny, flat surface coming off the bed. So the white shapes, they kind of look like ceramic tiles, which I think is evocative of space materials, you know, the outside of the space shuttle. And then it's my usual workflow of going back and forth between the digital world and the physical world and kind of refining the shapes and doing several rounds of printing and drawing and scanning and then printing and drawing and scanning. So by the time I sit down to make my 3D model, I know exactly what I want to make, and it's so this model came together really quickly. This is about 750 bodies. This was actually no problem for a Fusion 360 because now I'm working on a smaller amount of surface area. And it's the same technique of connecting the pieces together with the 3D pen, but this time I realized that I wanted to use the same color as my backing material. So if I get any, you know, over schmutz, you can't see it because it just blends in with that layer. And here you can see that it's really flexible. So it's a very soft and malleable kind of layer out there. And here is some of my tedious hand sewing that I had to do to connect it to the glove. But again, I like connecting these layers together with hand sewing instead of something like glue, because hand sewing is really easy to remove and it's non-destructive and it's really quick to put back in. And that's the complete outer glove before I put any lining into it. So I had to make that vinyl underlayer from scratch as well. And then for the fingers, like I said, I just wanted to print some flat shapes in TPU. So I traced the finger shapes and then just created those shapes in Illustrator, actually. Extruded them in Fusion 360. And then this is the finished glove. So here you can see it all assembled together, and like I said, you can come and find me and hold it and see how it's actually very light as well, and it does light up. And then on the other side, you can see how flexible those fingers are. They just, my plan was to glue them into place and then sew them down for real stability, but I didn't even have to do that because my glue held so well. So don't sleep on Super 77 because it's good stuff. But wear your respirator. So what I really want to do is make a spacesuit out of this glove because I feel like I'm getting to the impact part of my pyramid, because when I show people that glove, they ask me, like, is this part of a spacesuit? And I'm like, yes, it's working, like, it's coming across. And I'm definitely going to make that into a spacesuit because I love making spacesuits. This is one that I made a while back, and this is an original design. And, you know, this is what I really want to do. I want to make things that tell stories, and I want to use tools and techniques that serve that story. So actually something crazy happened during the pandemic. A filmmaker reached out to me and asked me if they could use my spacesuit in one of their music videos, and I was like, yeah, that sounds amazing. So I sent this spacesuit off to this filmmaker who took it to the Badlands in North Dakota and shot this amazing sci-fi space video, like spacesuit video, using my spacesuit. And if you like science fiction, you should totally find this video. It's King of Misery by this rock band called Saul. And this is like a cool sci-fi story with like a twist at the end, and it just trips me out. I can't believe this is my spacesuit from my brain. But I feel like that is really design success for me because I made a spacesuit out of my own mind, and this filmmaker said, yeah, that makes sense to me. I want to use that to tell my creative story. So that's a dream come true for me, and just like a sign that I'm on the right path, I think. So actually, after this video, he was like, I want to make another video. Can you make me a suit? So this is another video that I did a suit for. It's not a spacesuit. This video is about a maker kid who's getting bullied, and he creates his own Iron Man robot suit to like protect himself from his bully. So I built a suit using that concept and that idea, and sent it off, and they made this video, which is just like another like crazy, I just can't believe that happened. But I got to use my design brain to bring that story to life, which is just amazing. And so yeah, this is what I really want to do. I want to do work that tells stories. So check this one out too. This is First Train by Mayday Parade. So if you want to know more about my work, you can head over to my website, which is sophiewong.com, and see more stuff there. And then I can be found in all the usual places online. Twitter, for now, I guess? I don't, check back later. But yeah, that's all I have. Thank you so much.